pick up here, I have marked that we got, the last thing we really answered was question number 9 in the 4th chapter. Is that about where y'all had marked? 3rd chapter. I'm sorry. Well, sure it is 3rd chapter. I'm sorry. So it's pushed over to on, yes, but the light ain't on. It won't stay on. Nope, it's not doing it. Oh, okay. Hello. Okay. Yeah, I got that. Let me stick it right here in my jaw. Right here next to my cheek and gun. No, I'm not making a skull commercial. That's from a different era here. Okay. This next particular question begins in dealing with verses 9 and 10 of chapter 3. And of course, we're going to hit another section here in just a few minutes, but let's finish this up first. God is supposed to get the first fruits, or is he supposed to get the leftovers? And with what attendant blessing goes along with the choice there? What is God supposed to get? Obviously, he gets the leftovers. No, that may be what oftentimes happens, but he's supposed to get the first fruits. And of course, when we are simply faithful in giving God what he deserves, then we have the added blessing then of having more than we need. And of course, we understand that general rule for sure. As it relates to that particular subject, number 11, what are the presses that are referred to in verse 10? Places where you store what? Liquids. So presses is where you would mash out the olive oil or whatever other type of oil that you're engaged in. So here again, talking about the bounty that would result from this type of life. Number 12, where in verse 11, where is verse 11 quoted in the New Testament? Which means it is. So where in the New Testament is it specifically quoted? Anybody know? Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6 is where it is found there. And of course, that shouldn't really surprise us, seeing how God's the author of both the book of Proverbs as well as the book of Hebrews. Number 13, what is God's motivation when we are on the receiving end of correction? Of course, it's supposed to be the motivation for when we correct our children, or when the civil government corrects a citizen, or when the congregation corrects a member. It's love. The motivation obviously is love. Number 14, why is the man happy in verse 13, and why is he of this disposition, do you think? He's happy because he knows he's got understanding. He understands things. And that knowledge, of course, gives him then the capacity to be contentedly satisfied. Now, there is an area that the world needs, sometimes the world desires, but they try to find this contented happiness and satisfaction in places where it simply cannot be found. The word blessed in the first psalm, as well as in the Beatitudes, carries with it that same type of idea, contentedly satisfied, regardless of outside circumstances. Number 15, why is wisdom getting preferable to treasure getting? What kind of questions we find here? Why is wisdom to be preferred over treasure? All right, for thinking about the length of time in which you're able to benefit from it. Well, if you got all the treasure in the world, it's going to be limited to this life for sure. And you think of all the warnings that Scripture provides us with problems of treasures on earth, and some people, it's of course like a noose around the neck for those type of individuals. Number 16, what does keep mean in verse 21? Keep sound wisdom and discretion. It's the idea of guarding or of protecting, to preserve it. And you preserve by observing it, obviously. So wisdom needs to be kept. It's not something that you keep in the closet and every now and then you put it on and use it for a while. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Number 17, and this is based upon a number of verses from verse 22 through 26. To what extent does grace benefit from these verses? How does grace actually provide benefit? The picture.
Safety and confidence.
All right, safety and confidence. And the picture is like an ornament, an ornament that provides you with not only protection and motivation and all that's supposed to, that's here upon this earth, but of course, especially as it relates to eternal matters. You're able to pillow your head at night and not worry. That is a great blessing. And of course, it's one that sometimes we have a hard time enjoying because we evidently do not have all our ducks in a row. And so the wisdom that should allow us to not worry about stuff all night. I mean, it's easy to say that anxiety is a sin, but it's entirely a different thing to remove anxiety from your life. It's easy to say we ought not be anxious. But to not be anxious is a whole lot harder than just saying, I wish I wasn't anxious. It's a very, very difficult thing, for sure. All right, number 18. The confidence of a godly person is placed ultimately in who? Obviously, it's in God, isn't it? Any confidence that we have in man, sooner or later, we're going to be let down for sure, but not the Lord. Number 19, what does verse 27 make necessary? It says, withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in thy power of thy hand to do it. All right, I mean, when you have the opportunity to do it, then do it. I mean, the thing is, you act upon what you have the ability to do when you have the ability to do it. And those lost opportunities are, of course, gone forever. And, one of the saddest situations that we always have to deal with is procrastination. Just example, a fella called me today, and a fellow worker of his, 33 years old, came in the house, went to the kitchen and got the dishwashing liquid out from under the kitchen sink and went into the bedroom with it. And his child said, Daddy, what are you doing? And he said, I don't know. And he fell over with an aneurysm, and they unhooked him today. He's dead. And the guy that called me, I couldn't even hardly understand him because he was blubbering so bad. And he said, I didn't teach him. I did not attempt to lead him to the truth. And now I don't have any more chances, And I said, you lived a Christian life in front of him. I know you did. But he was just tore all to pieces. Procrastination is something that we don't need to be guilty of. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen from one minute to the next. Excuse me. Number 20. What typical failure on the part of mankind do we find condemned here in verse 28? Well, I just mentioned it. Just said it. Procrastination, for sure. Putting off till tomorrow what we rightfully know we need to do today. And, of course, that's not talking about keep putting your wife off to clean the carport off, Those things, then I keep telling my wife, those things don't amount to hill of beans. That don't matter in the long run, But there's some things that we put off till tomorrow and it'll cost us eternally. That just simply is not one of them. All right, number 21. Should one be concerned about the security of his neighbor? If there ever was a question that could be answered in the setting that we're having to deal with presently, especially in some big cities, then here's one of them. If you practice the golden rule, you'll certainly be concerned about your neighbor, won't you? You know, if you love your neighbor as you do yourself, which is the second great commandment, then you're going to have concern even for your neighbors. You should feel a personal responsibility to be a good neighbor, for sure. Number 22, what would be the result if verse 30 was followed, which says, strive not with a man without cause if he have done thee no harm. Boy, it'd be a nice place, wouldn't it? There's a whole lot of strife that would never even result if we simply didn't cause a problem where there was no problem to begin with. Number 23, how are verses 31 and 32 connected in this same thought here? If you're envious of a person that has more than you do, if you're envious of a person's prosperity, then sadly, the end of that is not going to be very attractive, for sure. You don't want because many times the envy that you have towards another person, that which they have may be wickedly obtained, and thus you are in fact guilty of participating and desiring something that's sinful to begin with. Number 24, what does Psalm 37:1 and Psalm 73:3 say concerning these things? All right, you know, it's always been the case that people would look at somebody else and say, that's just not fair. I mean, here's a sorry, scum of the earth person, and he drives the finest car on East Valley Road, you know. Or here's a person that don't give 2 cents for anything good and godly, and he's got better tomatoes than I do, you know. Well, it's easy for us to look at somebody else, and we are limited in our viewpoints as to the present, when, of course, God reminded David, you know, there is a payday coming someday. You know, all cases are not settled here on earth. The end result is what we need to be thinking about, and not be overly concerned with what other people have, and be envious of wicked people, for sure. Number 25, what do the wise have to look forward to? An inheritance. An inheritance that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you. Number 26, what do fools have to look forward to? All they have to look forward to is shame that's certain to come their way. And of course, the sooner they realize that to be the case, maybe they would amend their ways so that promotion to shame will not come about. All right, chapter 4. Why is there a change from the regular son, which has been the case in these previous chapters, to children now? There is a change. I think it's the son now is becoming the teacher. You know? He's been on the receiving end of the instruction, and now he's the one that's doing the teaching, and he's speaking to sons, okay? So here, to me, it looks like you got childhood memories that a wise man possesses, not possibly, you know, and so that's the distinction, I think, is there. And of course, if you got another idea, then by all means, take issue with that one. Number 2, what does doctrine mean anyhow? This means teaching. And here it is teaching is paralleled with law, okay? And believe it or not, law is not a bad word, although it is looked upon as a bad word by far too many, both in the secular field as well as in the spiritual field. Number 3, how should parents feel regarding their children? You know, do we have a vested interest in seeing to it that our children live righteous lives based upon a knowledge of the will of God? Well, sure. And those who at one time were children understand that may be better than those who've never been in that position, you know. Squandered opportunities as a child, you can look back upon those with regret, for sure. And make sure you don't make the same mistake with your children, for sure. Number 4, verse 4 describes what kind of parent. The right kind or the wrong kind? Obviously the right kind. The person that brings us up in the nurture, the admonition of the Lord, the discipline, the admonition, the training of the Lord. It's by design, that should describe all parents for sure. Number 5, what emphasis was placed upon wisdom and understanding as per verse 5 here? You're supposed to do what with it? Get it. You better get it. And of course the idea of get it is used evidently 7 times in the book. Get understanding. Get a hold of it and make it a part of your very being. Number 6, what ought to be prioritized and what will be the benefit of that? If you don't leave wisdom, and in wisdom you are preserved, then that protects you totally in whatever you engage in the future, for sure. Forgot to turn my silly phone off. There we go. All right, number 7. What connection can you see in verse 7 with the example that we have over in 1 Kings chapter 4? All right. When you think about what the principal thing is supposed to be, then salvation is the principal thing, and parents too many times are often ambitious for the children, but the ambition they have for the children is not so much for their spiritual betterment or their spiritual maturity, but for other things that are limited to this old world, for sure. Number 8, what will wisdom do for the person who possesses it? All right, there will be honor that will be heaped upon the person who possesses wisdom. He's brought up to a higher level in the eyes of people who know what's right and what's wrong, for sure. And number 9, what has a crown of glory? Or who has, a crown of glory? Same type of thought, isn't it? That's the decoration of the wise person. Here's his crown of glory, which is setting him apart from the regular old crowd because of him possessing this noble characteristic. Number 10, connecting verse 10 with 2 passages, one Exodus 20 at verse 12 and Ephesians chapter 6 verse 1 through 3. What is the thoughts expressed here that are also expressed there? All right, if you've got kids that are obeying their parents, then they can expect to live a long life. Now, is that a general rule, or is that a cold, hard, all-the-time fact? And if it is a general rule, in what way, and are there any examples that you could think of that would fit into this to make it a true proverb? If you're the right kind of parent, you're probably not going to tell your children to ride their bicycle down the middle of the highway, right? You're probably going to tell them to obey the speed limit, and you're going to probably tell them to wear their seatbelt. You're going to tell them don't participate in the intake of alcoholic beverages or drugs. You're going to try to help them to steer clear of all those things that will take their life at an earlier time, obviously. That doesn't mean that sometimes accidents happen that mess all that up, but generally speaking, obviously, if children obey the parents who are determined for their spiritual well-being, then those are going to be lives that are lived without the downfalls that oftentimes afflict so many. Number 11, what is the difference between taught and led here in verse 11? You can teach without leading, can't you? But you can lead and never say a word. So when a person is both teaching and the life that he lives is in harmony with the teaching, then that's going to obviously have a greater impact. Have you ever heard the statement made, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day? There's probably about 120 people say that every Sunday morning. Let's see one. We'd rather see one than hear one. But that goes a long way. Number 12, what's the meaning in verse 12 of these words? When something is straightened, what does that mean? It's sort of like the same way it's used in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13, 14. It's restricted. It's restricted. It's only a small amount can go through it, as is the case with the straight and narrow way that leads to heaven above. What about runnest? That simply means going fast, doesn't it? And stumbling, that's what you end up doing if you are abruptly stopped in your progress of running, for sure. And these have application, obviously. Number 13, what does fast hold involve, do you think? That should be hold fast, shouldn't it? If somebody holds fast, that means they have a firm grasp of something. They're not piddling around, but they're being earnest in what they're doing. Of course, that principle holds true, and whatever you do with all you might, as we'll see later. Number 14, what must not be entered into? Don't enter where? The path of the wicked. There's no reason to enter that path for sure. And turn away from it. Well, that's the next thing. What 4 specific things are given in regards to this wicked path? Number 1, avoid it.
Verse 15, right?
Yeah, verse 15, I'm sorry. You avoid it. You don't pass by it. You turn. If you happen to find yourself in it, you turn and go the opposite direction. And if you're in it, you leave it. So there's absolutely no reason why anybody should stay in that way for sure. Whatever you got to do, flee that direction, whatever happens. Number 16, people can become so deviant that they will be guilty of what? And I think that Micah chapter 2 at verse 1 speaks of this as well. Have you ever heard of anybody who would plan the night before of what wicked deeds they're going to do tomorrow? You know? I used to think when I was working over here in Chattanooga that the bosses would lay in the bed at night and say, what can we do tomorrow to really make them mad? You know, they were devising all these different ways that they could really hurt us. And people are like that so many times, planning for wickedness for the next day while they're laying in bed at night. That happens. Number 17, what is the sustaining nourishment of such a perverse person as that? The wickedness of those individuals, their scheming is to try to pull others down to the level they are at. You know, that's their desire. They want company in their sorriness. Number 18, the path of the just refers to what, do you think? That simply it's in opposition to what's been said relative to the evil path. That's the way that the Lord wants you to go. A way that you ought to travel, and the way that the just or the lawful do travel. Number 19, why does the Father go over the same thoughts as in verse chapter 20? Why does he keep on saying the same thing? It's obvious that he's got kids. He knows you can't say it once. You got to keep on saying the same thing. Repetition, repetition. That's the ingredient. And of course, because we know that we were guilty at one time, if not still, of needing to be told over and over and over and over again the same thing. And we're thankful for that too later on in life. Number 20, what 2 parts of a person are spoken of here in verse 21? The eyes and the heart. Verse 22, speaking literally or figuratively. For they are life unto those that find them, and health to all. Is that the right verse? Yeah. And light to and health to all their flesh. Life and health. Well, sure. You know. And the thing is, when you get to actual, you know, there's a bunch of different terms that sometimes we use synonymously that are not really synonymous. Like when Jesus said, I am the door, was he a literal door? No, he was an actual door. He is an actual door. You know, he is the actual door, but he's not a literal door made out of aluminum or cast iron or oak or wood. And so that's the distinction, I think, that I was trying to get at in this particular question. You know, one of those things where when you write a question, it sounds so wonderful, and then you go back and look at it and you think, what in the world was I thinking about? And sadly, the older I get, the more of them I seem to have. And of course, the comparison too, remember in John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Well, is he literally the way, the truth, and the life? Yeah, he is. He actually is. That's not a figurative type thing. All right, number 22. How would you paraphrase verse 23? Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. All right. I mean, they follow one after the other. If a person guards his intellect, guards his attitude, then his life is going to follow that which has been guarded zealously in his mind. Number 23. What is a froward mouth, or I think it's my self-correcting. I don't know why it just does that at certain times, but it's supposed to be here in verse 23. It's froward instead of forward. What is a froward or a forward mouth? Why would that be difficult to understand? Well, it's compared in verse 24 here to be perverse lips. So if you've got perverse lips, which is the froward mouth, then the difficulty is in understanding those that are possessed with those type. And of course, this is in contrast to what he's just got through saying. Number 24, what is the summary idea of all of this in verse 25? Don't what? Don't let your eyes wander. Don't let your eyes wander. That's a problem. That's why you don't like having a classroom at school that's right next to the road, because kids have the tendency to not pay attention to what they're doing. They look out the window. Number 25, what does ponder mean, do you think, in verse 26? If you ponder something, you think about it, you know. You mentally weigh the situation. And if you do that, if you are pondering properly, then that'll keep you from getting tripped up when you start proceeding, when you start walking. Number 26, how much deviation is allowed from the proper path you ought to go? No deviation. You're not supposed to turn to the left or the right. Just stay right there with the truth. And of course, one of the classic examples of that instruction is back when Joshua was taking the leadership role of the children of Israel after the death of Moses in Joshua chapter 1 at verse 7. Don't turn to the right, don't turn to the left, stay right with the truth. All right, chapter 5. How should a father teach his son? All right? And of course the simple idea here is that he's passing on lessons learned in life, real life experiences and situations which will assist the child to not make maybe some of the same mistakes that the dad is aware of, or maybe even bad choices that the dad made. So he's simply imparting that wisdom to the child. Number 2, how will wisdom display itself? All right? It's going to be obvious from the decisions that are made. It's going to, the judgment calls are going to be based upon solid evidence. Ability to distinguish between right and wrong is going to be obvious. Paying attention to and following this way is going to be obvious to see. You can tell that this has happened. Number 3, what did the figures of speech drop as a honeycomb and smoother than oil describe? It's obviously not good here, is it? No. This honeycomb, smoother than oil, has reference to deceitful, alluring, flattering speech. And of course, if a person can be swayed by that, then that's a part of the reason why it's deceitful, is because it can sway a person. Number 4, how does the end of verse 4 contrast with the promises that are projected in verse 3? You know, instead of sweet, instead of smooth and oil, then we end up with a bitter end. And of course, the very opposite of what was spoken of, and the way the speaking was done, ends up happening to this person. And of course, we know we're going to see exactly who's involved in this. Number 5, what is the destination of the evil woman's way? Where will she end up? She's going to end up dead. She's going to end up in the Hades. She's going to end up in Sheol, the grave, and also sometimes translated the pit. And of course, that's the evil woman's result. Number 6, what kind of person is this woman? How is she described in verse 6? Her ways are movable. What does that mean? She's not very stable, is she? She's not very stable at all. So you better be careful. You better be careful. It's this type of person that's mentioned here is impossible to predict. It's impossible for this young man to conceive all the ways of this woman, because, as we'll see, this woman is a sexually immoral woman, and she's got a lot of tricks up her sleeve. Number 7, what is the significance of verse 7, where Solomon says, "Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth." Now, this is right in the midst of this discussion of this woman that he needs to avoid. Of course, he's saying if there ever was a time that you need to pay attention to what I've told you, it's right now. You know, he interjects that into the midst of the discussion because he can be so easily trapped. He's not thinking, he's not reasoning correctly, and so he's getting too close to being destroyed, devoured. Number 9, how deeply does a person usually get involved in a situation like this? Lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel. Well, that sounds like more than a momentary problem, doesn't it? Sounds like you're talking about something to which you get entrapped that'll end up in a long time of misery, sadly. Number 10, how would strangers be filled with his wealth, this fella? All right, they end up getting the money that he's worked for. And of course, you can think about all types of thievery and deception and all that will be involved in such a life as lived by this woman, and this young man is not smart enough to be able to avoid it, and he finds himself in this predicament. To the extent that verse 11, or question 11 says, what effect does such living have on the body? If a person is constantly in the embrace of a sexually deviant woman who's not his wife, then how is that going to end up how is that going to affect his body? Have you ever heard of a thing called AIDS or sexually transmitted diseases? I mean, all those things, disease and suffering, all that is the end result of following this type of lifestyle. Number 12, what instruction had not been heeded? Well, what the father had warned him about and hadn't been paid attention to as it should, and so now there's a great amount of remorse because they did not pay attention. And so here they are in this predicament with this woman. Number 13, what's the meaning of verse 14? I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. Of course, in all evil just means every type of wickedness, comparatively speaking. All types of wickedness with such a person as this. And even in the presence of a congregational assembly, well, you know, this fella can obviously, just because he ends up making his way to worship services, at the time that he's not at worship service, he's in the embrace of this woman, then what in the world is he doing in such a situation as this to begin with? He ought to feel terrible. Number 14, to what does drink waters from thine own cistern refer to? Yeah, you've got a wife. A woman, if you've got a husband, that's who you're supposed to be with. That's the arrangement that God has. The sexual relationship is not dirty when it's where God intended for it to be, between a man and a woman joined together in holy matrimony. So instead of adultery, here is where this arrangement is supposed to be. And to have an arrangement such as this in another situation is a defiling of the intentions of God. Number 15, fountains and rivers refers to what, do you think, here in verse 16? Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad and the rivers of waters in the streets. Now, so, because of what's said in verse 17, then it seems as though this is talking about legitimately providing offspring through the spouse that you're married to. Whereas a contrast is made in verse 17, let them be only thine own and not strangers with thee. Now, if that's not a reference to illegitimate children from this adulterous relationship, then I'm not seeing the contrast here. And that's possible too, for sure. All right, number 4. And since roe and hind are often used in the poetry, erotic poetry of the East, with who, it should be whom, I guess, alone were such sexual relations authorized. Well, obviously, I mean, it's you husbands and wives. In verse 21, how should men respond to verse 20, which says, and why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger? You might be able to get by with it here. Nobody, including your spouse, may know anything about it. But guess who does? God does. God knows. You know, there's that all-seeing eye watching you. You know, now that's comforting, but at the same time, that lets us know that even if you think nobody knows, there is somebody that knows, and the one that knows is the one with whom you must give an account one day. Number 19, how is the miserable end of the wicked pictured here in verse 22 and 23? He's held with what? Cords, which is talking about what? He's tied up, you know. He's in a trap. And he keeps on being in that trap as long as he keeps on playing the fool in this arrangement. So as he keeps on, he's just getting further and further embedded in this trap and the tying up of it. Number 20, what descriptive terms are applied to sin in verse 23? Interesting words nonetheless. Die without instructions, and in the greatness of his folly shall he go astray. Now, the word that's translated folly here carries with it the idea of lack of understanding, foolishness. Here's an individual who had the opportunity to know better, did know better, but he's certainly not acting like it when he is engaging in this type of activity. Has this always been a problem? Well, sure. Will it always be a problem? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's not a problem that cannot be corrected with right thinking and right acting, for sure. Chapter number 6. What does it mean to have stricken thy hand? And have you ever done that? Well, I think so. Here it is, what you're doing. You're making an agreement, and what are you doing? You're shaking on it. So here is a shaking of hands on the matter. And it's parallel here to be a surety. So this was back before you had to have it signed in blood, you know. Here's when your word was your bond. Here's when you agreed on something, then it was intact. Can you imagine a time in which a handshake was a binding contractual agreement? Boy, we've come a long way, haven't we? Number 2, what word explains the word snared as used in verse 2? Do what, Jim? Exactly. It doesn't matter if it turns out to not your liking, you're still bound to the matter. Don't be tricked by the words that are used, for sure. Number 3, how does one deliver himself from a setting like this? When thou art come into the hand of thy friend, go and humble thyself and make sure thy friend. In other words, here's a personal discussion that's engaged. You don't say run and get a good lawyer, you know. But here you are trying to get out of an agreement that you've made with a friend and humbly doing whatever is necessary to get released from this obligation, you know. Is anything wrong with that? Well, of course not. If it's to the liking of the individual with whom the agreement was made to begin with. And number 4, why give not sleep to thine eyes? And of course it's the same context, which simply means take care of this before you go to bed, you know. Don't let this drag on and on and on and on. Take care of it. Promptly deal with the situation. Guess what? If there's a bad deal that's done, putting it off to tomorrow is just going to make it worse. Trying to avoid seeing the person with whom you've made the deal is just going to make it worse. He's going to think, he's avoiding me, you know. Well, reckon what you're doing. You're avoiding him. So the best thing to do is go ahead and deal with that. Isn't it obvious how practical just that little bit of advice in those 4 verses is? Number 5, what lesson is taken from the animal kingdom in verse 5 here? All right. In other words, you have to be able to see and to understand that there's danger involved. Animals do, you know. You wonder how did that animal know that there was a trout that was stuck there under them leaves and it just went right around it? How did it do that? Well, animals sometimes have more sense than men do, sadly. And so as an animal flees from captivity, and if he gets caught, then he exerts a great deal of energy to get free, then surely we got as much sense as an animal in regards to that. Number 6, for what particular trait is the ant mentioned in verse 6? Go to the ant, thou who? Sluggard. And of course, sluggard is just a fancy word for a lazy bum, you know, a person that refuses to do anything. But that's certainly not the way the ant is. The ant is not lazy. The ant is full of activity, has a job to do, and he does it the very best that he can. Number 7, do ants have a leader? They do. But the amazing thing about the leader of the ants is he's not a slave driver, you know. And just because you are in the position of being the leader or the boss doesn't mean you have to be a slave driver either. Number 8, what are some characteristic habits of the ant? Verse 8. Well, we don't usually think about that. But what is the ant doing when he's doing all that work? He's preparing for the future. He's preparing while it's harvest time to the time when there won't be anything to harvest. Isn't that amazing? The government's not going to step in and bail him out. No, it's not going to happen. Number 9, is sleeping in for healthy people encouraged in the Bible? Answer is no, it's not. The idea of sleeping in is sometimes necessary. At least that's what my wife says every Saturday morning. After she's worked all week at school, Monday through Friday and Sunday too, then sleeping in on Saturday is a actual need, she says. But if you make it a habit of sleeping in, then don't be surprised if that becomes a habit, and then you end up being the sluggard that's referred to here as spending too much time sleeping. And we're not talking about a person that's sick or has got sleeping sickness or anything like that. We're just talking about, and the writer is talking about a lazy person. Number 10, this same idea. What emphatic word is found in verse 10, and to what all is it applied? The operative term, the adjective is little. Little. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of hands. When I was young, we're going to have to quit right there. When I was young, people lied all the time. They told me that the older you get, the less sleep you need. That was the biggest lie, and that's crazy. Why did they say that? Now, they did say that the older you get, the faster time goes. That's true. But, Jim, are you now to the point where you don't even have to sleep at night? Freddie, do you have to sleep at night anymore? Have you got to the age where you can get by on 30 minutes of sleep a night? There ain't no way.
Maybe what they meant was because when you get older, you've got so many sore places you can't sleep.
That might be it. There ain't no such thing as a good night's sleep. Or as one fellow said, I knew that the best part of the day was over when I heard the alarm clock go off. Thank y'all so much. And if we keep up that pace right there, we'll make it. Thank y'all.